Hello there! Welcome to What is Themed Entertainment? My name is Kira, and I'll be walking you through this overview of the themed entertainment industry and what specifically the discipline of themed entertainment is and how it differs, say, from traditional architecture or urban design, and also how its storytelling differs from the types of stories you might be more used to in books or movies. Themed entertainment is something I'm really passionate about and also really excited about its growth into the future. The industry has seen continual growth every decade, and really at this point can be found everywhere, not just in theme parks. And that's really not all that surprising when you start to look at the history of the industry and realize that its roots actually go back quite far. But more about that in a bit. First, I want to spend just a second or two talking about who this course is for and what I hope you'll get out of it. And really, it's targeted towards a few specific groups of people. First and foremost, if you're completely new to the world of themed entertainment design, then this course is for you. If you just discovered the industry, perhaps you're a college student just deciding what you want to do, or you're a professional with a specific skill set but are looking to how to use those tools more in a way that's geared toward this industry, welcome. Second, to those of you that are already perhaps familiar with themed entertainment, maybe you grew up going to theme parks, you're a big fan, or you've worked in the industry a couple years, but you've never quite had a chance to think about why exactly what you're doing works, other than story is important, welcome. We're going to try to dig into the discipline a bit and try to really answer why exactly story is important and how it functions in the built world. And finally, if you're just interested in the topic and want to hear one additional perspective on the industry, no matter how long you've been in it, or you're just a casual fan, then please welcome as well. Happy to have you here. So let's talk a little bit about this course and what to expect. By the end of the next hour or so, you should be able to walk away with an understanding of what narrative and experience design principles are and how they work together to create theme. Also, to understand what theme itself is and how it differs from, say, subject. And finally, have a general sense of the tools at the disposal of the themed entertainment designer, and also have a general sense of how story applies to themed entertainment. And one more thing before we get started, I just want to talk a little bit about who I am and where I'm coming from. Like I said before, my name is Kira, and for purposes of this class, I'm your all-around theme park nerd. I was born and raised here in Orlando, Florida. I was really privileged to have grown up around the parks here, and because of that, that bias is probably going to creep in every now and then. But I've tried to include destinations from around the country and the world, as theme entertainment is by no means limited to just here. My background's also in film and cinema. I had a whole career working in the movies and TV for a while, went to film school and all that, and undoubtedly the way I was taught to analyze films there and look at them as sort of deeper pieces of art has no doubt shaped my perspective on this industry. In fact, one of the things I hope to do in this class and others down the road is give some of that perspective of storytelling analysis that you might not have gotten if you're coming from a more design or engineering background. And finally, to state the obvious, I'm a white woman. I mention this specifically because there are many traditions of storytelling that sort of, quote-unquote traditional Western white culture has typically ignored, and I might very well be blind to some of those insights or end up stating what might otherwise be obvious. And also, as a general point, I certainly don't want to claim this lecture as like the definitive explanation of the industry. It's just my personal observations over, a long time of experience and a compilation of insight from people that are a lot smarter than me. So with all that out of the way, let's dig in and start to explore. What is themed entertainment? Okay, so let's begin to try to answer this question. What is themed entertainment? What is it? Well, first off, the name of the field is a little bit of a misnomer. It's called themed entertainment because the modern, interpretation of the discipline got started with theme parks, and it's most often seen today in entertainment venues. But I think it's really important to acknowledge right off the bat that themed entertainment is not just theme parks and not just for entertainment. I love theme parks and I love being entertained, and you probably do too. It's certainly what got me interested in the field to begin with. And, there's no doubt that it's heavily influenced the industry, but it's really just the tip of the iceberg. Themed entertainment is really a design philosophy based in storytelling. And it can apply to just about anything in the built world, whether it's museums, shopping malls, lifestyle centers, housing developments, national parks, memorials, anything. It's all about the story. What is the story that's being told, and how is the built environment being used to tell that story? That's all that themed entertainment really is. But this is the first thing that starts to trip people up. Story? Do experiences actually tell stories? What's the story of Pirates of the Caribbean? Do I need to construct an entire elaborate tale about little Billy and how he dreamed of flying before I can build an airplane museum? What does it mean for a story to be in the built environment? And we'll get there. But what I want you to remember right now is that at the heart of every story is theme. Just as you'll hopefully remember from your high school English class, theme is the central idea of a work, what it's about. This is the key to understanding themed entertainment. It's in the name, themed entertainment. And if you only walk away from this class remembering one thing, it's this: that experiences combined with narrative together create theme. That's what really this whole class is about, really. Experience times narrative equals theme. Theme design, broadly speaking, is the combination of these two distinct design philosophies: experience design and narrative design working together to tell stories. Let me talk a little bit about what I mean by that. On the one hand, there's a really long tradition of embedding narrative into physical places. And when I say long, I mean really long. If you want to get pedantic, you can look back as far as cave paintings and hieroglyphics painted on tomb walls. It's really been the default in design for most of human history. This picture on the left here is of Notre Dame Cathedral. There's narrative sculpted into the pillars, poured into the stained glass. Literally every corner they could find has some statue representing some bit of history or myth in it. And you'll find the same exact narrative-based detailing whether you were looking at an ancient Roman temple or the Chrysler building, right? Narrative has been built into the world for as long as humans have been building. It's only really with the rise of modernism in the 20th century that this tradition is kind of interrupted, and those details in narrative are deemed superfluous. And even then, that impulse still remains and can be found everywhere. Just as a for instance, take this photo of a bridge that was this was taken in the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. Just take a look at it for a moment. It's communicating a narrative. It's proposing a value structure. The National Park Service could have built any kind of bridge they wanted, and you could probably make the argument that something, out of concrete or steel would have been more functional. But no, they decided that stone steps and a hewn log made the most sense because they're creating a narrative around the value of nature. Or you can take a look at this KFC. If you've ever been to Marietta, Georgia, you'll recognize it. It's called the Big Chicken. And it actually used to be a different chicken restaurant before it was purchased by KFC. It was built in 1956, and it's clearly inspired by modernism, right? It gets rid of that lavish detail that you might have seen a few, decades before, like at that theater on the upper left, but, it still can't resist that temptation to express its narrative. And that's what narrative design is all about. And let's contrast that with experience design. And just a note here, I'm not necessarily talking about user experience design or UX, though it kind of has similar goals. UX typically refers to user interface design in software and kind of industrial design, whereas I'm talking about something with a bit more holistic, of a design impulse, but they are similar. Experience design is all about emotions, right? How am I going to make someone feel, and how am I going to do that? I could put them through all sorts of physical, visceral sensations. I could blast them from 0 to 80 in a couple seconds, or dazzle their eyes, or hurl them through the air. I can make them feel excited, awed, or scared, or sick. But of course, there's other ways to shape emotions too, and you can use experience design in that way too. Right? The way we interact with the world itself is an experience, and those experiences can delight us or frustrate us. They can tell us we're welcome and that we belong, or they can tell us that we're unwanted. They can make things feel seamless or endlessly frustrating. Successful brands live and die by the experiences they create, and the ones that are particularly good at it end up creating extremely loyal customers. Anyone that's watching this from the West Coast is undoubtedly looking at that In-N-Out burger menu, and their mouth is watering. It's, controversial opinion. I'm from the East Coast. I think it's just a hamburger. But it's that experience that they've created that people have, it's become part of their lives. And that's what it inspires such attachment. So just to make the difference in approach a little bit more tangible, I thought we'd do an exercise to demonstrate exactly how these approaches work. So let's say you've been tasked with designing a new park for a city. Not a theme park, just your average city park. What do you design? How do you go about doing it? Well, if you don't have any knowledge of experience or narrative design ideas, you might design something like this. You ask yourself, What does a park have? Well, it'll probably have some trees, maybe a lake, a playground. Voila, a park. And there's not anything necessarily wrong with this approach. It does make a functional enough park. But there's a lot more that you could bring to it. For instance, say I'm a designer now who solely comes from an experienced focus point of view. I come in right from the beginning and I say, I want this park to create a specific feeling. Everything about this park, for example, is going to create a feeling of tranquility and reflection. That's what I want. And so you immediately start shaping the park in the way that reflects that. So, for instance, in this example, I've created a central area that's designed for peace and reflection. That's kind of sheltered from the rest of the city around it, and I put water in that area to add to the tranquil feeling. Because you come from an experience point of view, you also know that every single detail adds up to create the overall emotional experience. You make the paths accessible so that everyone feels the same ease. You make sure the park is easy to get to with public transit so that people aren't anxious when they arrive. You're taking into account things like the height of the trees, making sure the park is safe, and it goes on and on and on. Everything to create this experience of reflection and tranquility. I think it's a much better experience than, the previous design. But it is lacking in meaning. The only meaning it really has comes from what guests bring. Now, meanwhile, say, there's another designer strongly schooled in the narrative design tradition, and they're given the task of designing this park. Narrative design excels at meaning. This designer knows that there's a prominent member of the community, for instance, who recently passed away. We're going to call him Sir Ida Gooddeeds. And Mr. Gooddeeds was famous for giving out free water to the homeless people in the area. And so this narrative designer decides that this whole park is going to pay tribute to his memory. And the park is designed with lots of water features and fountains to represent this story. There's a big statue of Gooddeeds right in the center of the park. And all the park facilities are built right around the statue. Murals on them reflecting the timeline of Mr. Gooddeeds' life. Maybe there's even an exhibit in there somewhere. The whole park tells a story about this man's life. Great. We have meaning. But it might also feel a little superficial, more like a piece of art than an actual place. And sometimes that's all you need, but it kind of depends on what you're going for. But now, say we were to combine all of the insights of each of these approaches together. We take the required program of a generic city park, and we take the insights of the experience-based design and let's focus on emotions. And we take the meaning of the narrative designer and put them all together. A real Reese's Cup moment. Can create something truly unique. We decide to make a space designed for tranquility and reflection, and we target that reflection to the life of Mr. Gooddeeds. We create a feedback loop where the experience creates emotions that support the narrative, and the narrative itself leads back to the emotion. So in this example, we keep the central peaceful reflection area of the experience designer, but we explicitly imbue like a water motif in it. And the statue of Gooddeeds is placed dead center, so everyone knows what it's about. And we include the fountains to drive home the point and create a gentle water sound, which is very relaxing. And we specifically include water fountains as well, like drinking fountains, as a focal point. So everyone gets to experience the good deed of Mr. Gooddeeds themselves. And the homeless population always has a place to get clean and free water. It echoes the good deeds that Mr. Gooddeeds himself did. The park facilities are consolidated into one focal point as well. And that provides kind of a natural weenie to draw people in to learn more about the history of the area. Everything works together to fully put guests into the story we're trying to tell. And, if we had infinite time, we'd kind of repeat this process over and over and over, multiple inception layers deep, considering every possible detail and moment of the guest journey to reinforce it through all the senses. That is what themed entertainment is. And that's why it's so powerful. We're creating a feedback loop of experience and narrative that really can lodge inside people's brains in an intimate and really visceral way. And we'll talk more about that later as well. But remember that when it comes to themed entertainment, story is what exists in the mind after an experience. And as theme entertainment designers, what we're really doing is we're presenting people, with a series of experiences that have been constructed around a specific narrative, so that when people walk away and remember what they just went through, they're left with a story. Story is really how we understand the world. And as designers, we have the ability to pick just the right experiences necessary to create it. So let's talk about narrative design. When we talk about narrative, the most important thing to understand is the idea of theme. Theme is super important. After all, we're talking about themed entertainment. We've named the entire industry after it. It must be important. Theme is really the core of narrative. Wherever there's a narrative, wherever there's a story, theme is somewhere lurking to be found, even if it wasn't put there intentionally. But when it comes to themed attractions, the word theme can become kind of confusing because it can be used in a few different ways. So let's break it down. If you haven't read the book Theme Park Design by David Younger, I highly recommend it. And he breaks down the word theme like this. There is manifestation theme, dramatic theme, and also the phrase theming or themed. And these three cover the major ways the word theme can be used. And we'll look at each of them. So first, I want to get the word theming out of the way. Simply put, this is really just a way to refer to the decoration or the architectural style, the props or set design of an area. So you might say that the buildings around Dollywood are themed to the Appalachian Mountains because they tend to use board and bat construction and sheet metal roofs. The old mining and logging equipment scattered around that park is theming that fits in with that area. And this is kind of a common colloquialism that's used for getting things done. You can say, hey, move that theming over there, or, well, theme that warehouse to look like a glacier. But it's not all that useful in actually explaining what we're really doing in themed entertainment design, because it really distracts from the why of the reason those elements are there. So I'm not really going to use it that much. The second way you'll hear theme used is as a manifestation theme. This tends to be how the average person sort of thinks of the word theme in theme parks. And to be honest, there's a good reason for that. Manifestation is the tangible, visible topic of an area. Frontierland has a frontier theme. Main Street USA is themed, there's that word again, to a small town Main Street in the United States. This is where the term theme park actually originates. But there's a problem. What we're really talking about when we talk about theme in this way is the subject of an area. The subject of this area is Harry Potter. The subject of this place is Coca-Cola, a haunted mansion, or a mysterious mine. Think of subject a bit like you might think of a protagonist. A protagonist isn't necessarily what a story is about, right? The Three Little Pigs isn't about three little pigs. They're merely the subject of the story. The story is about how hard work pays off. Which brings me to dramatic theme. Dramatic theme is the theme we really want to be talking about. Dramatic theme is what's at the core of narrative. Ideas are at the core of narrative. The dramatic theme tells us something about the subject, or sometimes something through the subject by using metaphor, allegory, or symbolism, things like that. Joe Roney, who's a themed entertainment designer behind Animal Kingdom, who incidentally gives free masterclasses on his Instagram, you should absolutely follow him, has emphasized this distinction. He points out that Animal Kingdom, the theme park, has a subject of animals. The theme isn't animals. Animals aren't an idea. They're a thing. Themes are ideas. The park itself has several themes: the intrinsic value of nature, transformation through adventure, and a personal call to action. And you can see all of these themes represented in the park icon, the Tree of Life. The park icon isn't just a statue of a tiger or something, it's a tree. The most valuable real estate in the park is given to a tree because this park is telling us that it believes nature is a valuable thing. And into the tree, all these animals are carved because animals, our subject, can show us that intrinsic value of nature. It really is a brilliant park icon, right? It communicates all these ideas non-verbally and subconsciously. The tree doesn't stop there, though. The tree itself is something theme park designers call a weenie. It's a large focal point that draws attention and beckons you towards it. It's a personal call to action. Come here. And approaching the tree is itself an adventure. You can't actually approach it head on. You must kind of explore around it, looking for a path to get there. And if you do, you're rewarded with several paths that wind around it, as well as an attraction inside. And as you get closer, you discover all sorts of features and hidden places you didn't know about. You get to see the carvings up close, and the animals really become apparent. The entire icon is transformed. Transformation through adventure. All the themes are contained in this one central icon through the use of this interplay between subject and theme. And that's because subject and theme work together to create narrative. It's the interplay between the two that really matters. Together is where the meaning is created. But let's backtrack a bit. Remember the Three Little Pigs? Remember how I said that the story wasn't about the three pigs, but the value of hard work? Let's look into that. So, just in case you don't remember or don't know, the Three Little Pigs is a fable whose origins go back centuries. There's three pigs that set off to build themselves houses. And the first two pigs want to play, and they're kind of lazy, so they hastily build their houses. The first out of straw, and the second out of sticks, and then go off and play on the rest of the day. And in fact, they even make fun of the third pig, who takes all day building a house of bricks and doesn't get to play. Well, the next day, a wolf comes to town, and the first two pigs' houses are so weak, he's able to just blow them down. And in some versions of the story, he actually eats the pigs. And in others, they run away to shelter in the third pig's house. And of course, because that house is made out of sturdy brick, the wolf can't blow it down no matter how hard he tries. And of course, because it's a brick house with a nice hearth, the third pig is able to build a fire and trick the wolf, who tries to come down the chimney, and the wolf becomes dinner instead. Children's stories are so dark. So let's think about this story for a moment. Why do we tell our kids this story? Does it have anything to do with pigs? Are we trying to educate our kids in the proper methods of home construction? No, of course not. We're trying to instill in them a specific moral and using the story as an example to explain why hard work and sacrifice now pays off in the future. And we do that through the tools of narrative design, character, the three pigs and the wolf, setting, the countryside and their houses, and the plot, how the characters interact with each other, and the setting and in what order. It's a set of events. The pigs build houses, the wolf attempts to blow them down. And symbolism. All of these elements are symbols. The first two pigs represent laziness and only thinking about the present. The third pig represents sacrifice and hard work. The same with their houses. The wolf represents bad events that come your way, and the plot is a battle between these symbols. What happens when near-term thinking and long-term thinking come face-to-face with adversity? The person who plans ahead wins. That's what the story is about. Now, the Three Little Pigs is only one form of narrative, and there are several, but they tend to fall into one of two categories. First, we have linear narrative. The Three Little Pigs is a linear narrative. It relies on a chain of cause and effect to tell its story. That's plot. The pigs need houses, so they build them, and they have different desires, so they build them differently. A wolf comes to town, and some of the pigs suffer, and the third prevails because of their decisions. How the story constructs these events is set up in payoff. The houses are specifically built so that they can be blown down. The house is built of bricks so that it can't be blown down and can have a fire. The first two pigs make fun of the third pig, specifically so the third pig can later say, "Hey, I told you so." Linear stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. They start in one place, in one state of affairs, and end up someplace else. Even stories that are told backwards or out of order, like Memento or Westworld, still are inherently linear. It's still about the plot and what happened when. The ordering just makes it a little bit more fancy or interesting. This is the kind of storytelling that everyone is very familiar with. It's the vast majority of every book, movie, or play ever written. And it's also the kind of storytelling you see in dark rides, many walkthrough attractions and exhibits. Anytime there's a predetermined sequence of events, that's linear narrative, which we contrast with non-linear narrative. Non-linear narrative doesn't have a beginning, middle, or an end. It exists all at once. There is no plot, or rather, if there is a plot, it's something that happened before, or something that's currently happening to you, maybe. Non-linear narrative uses things like atmosphere, forensic storytelling, and whole constellations of events happening simultaneously to create a narrative. Non-linear narrative is also how real life works. If I go to a cocktail party, and this is an example that Walt Disney once used to describe Pirates of the Caribbean, if I go to a cocktail party, there's no predetermined set of events I'm going to experience. I'm going to walk around, hear snippets of conversations, deduce information about the attendees, and only after the fact will I piece together a narrative of what it was that I experienced. This kind of storytelling makes its way into some video games, galleries, architecture. In theme entertainment, it's the way individual themed lands communicate their stories, as well as things like free-flowing exhibits and playgrounds. Now, I want to take a moment and really talk about one of the ideas on this list here, because it's such a huge part of how stories are told in the built environment. And that's forensic storytelling. Forensic storytelling is a term that was coined by Ian Kay a few years ago that really describes this aspect of how environments tell stories by leaving us clues about what happened or happens there. It's story by deduction. This is one of my favorite examples, though sadly it's no longer around. And it's worth noting that this example is something that wasn't planned. It was drawn from real life. If you've ever been to Disney's Fort Wilderness Campground, you might recognize it. It was called the lawnmower tree. Why? Well, take a look closer. That's a tree growing out of a lawnmower, like an old-fashioned lawnmower. Which means what? That the lawnmower was there before the tree. Suddenly we know something about this place, about events that happened way before we ever set foot there. We know that at some point in the past, someone left a lawnmower sitting out and left it there so long that a tree was able to grow right up around it. The person that used to be here was so lazy, right? They just left a lawnmower there so long that a tree grew out of it. Or perhaps the owner suddenly had to leave in a hurry and never came back, right? And we know it happened a long time ago because there's been enough time for quite a big tree to grow out of it, right? That's a forensic story. One of the things I really like about forensic stories is they allow for a subtle level of interactivity between the guest and the environment. The guest is able to bring a little bit of themselves to a story, project their own experiences and interpretations onto a space, which makes it feel just a little bit more personal. And there's plenty more examples. We encounter them every day. Here's another one of my favorites. It's a whole story in one image. And you smile. There's a whole interactive process happening in your mind where you see the book and you wonder what's special about it. And you see the inky paw prints and then put two and two together. Instantly, you're transported back in time to whenever this book was being handwritten. And some cat was being an absolute jerk and walked all over it with inky paws. This is another example of a situation that happened in real life and how the forensic story was embedded into that object. But as theme entertainment designers, we're able to purposely construct vignettes like these, and they're often the backbone of nonlinear narrative. Don Carson, who's another theme entertainment designer, has a whole VR museum exhibit exploring this type of thing, and I highly encourage you to give him a Google. So that's narrative design. Remember, it's all about constructing the theme. So now that we know what narrative design is, let's talk about its counterpart, experience design. What is it? How does it work? Well, basically, experience design is the opposite of whatever the hell this is. Like, can you feel these pictures? The anxiety is already crawling under my skin. If you've ever flown on a plane, or my condolences, had to depart LAX for an evening flight, you know how that everything about that experience seems to be designed to be the most unpleasant, chaotic, anxiety-provoking thing imaginable. And that's because nothing in that whole progression of events is really designed with the experience in mind. Experience is an afterthought to logistics, profit, and working around decades of lack of foresight and planning. And to make matters worse, the airlines specifically make the experience in coach worse in hopes that you just won't be able to tolerate it and pony up for a slightly nicer version of torture up in first class. Think about how that whole situation makes you feel, how uncomfortable the seat is, how unfair it can feel, how many fights end up breaking out, how you and the person in front of you will fight the whole 5 hours on how far the seat can recline without them sleeping in your lap. You know, all those emotions. Experience design from the guest perspective is ultimately about emotion design. What emotions are you going to feel every step of the way through this journey? But let's backtrack a bit. Remember our friends, the three little pigs? Well, when I summarized the story earlier, I left out a crucial bit of information. Do you know what it is? I summarized the plot, but I left out how the story is told. You know, when parents tell the story to their kids, they don't just tell them about the pigs, they make it a whole experience. Surely you remember, for example, every time the wolf threatens to blow down the house, he goes, "And I'll huff, and I'll puff, and I'll blow your house down." And the toddlers giggle and giggle, and they join in. And anytime the wolf demands to be led into one of the houses, the pigs reply, "Not by the hairs on my chinny chin chin." These phrases are using tools of oral storytelling. They're using rhythm, intonation, repetition, and interactivity to create an experience of delight for the kids. The story could be told in a lot of ways. It could be told like a dry news report. It could be told like a horror story. It was a dark and stormy night, and then the wolf came. But no, it's told in a fun, jolly way that gets the kids involved and delighted. That makes it memorable. It makes it repeatable. You know, if you heard the story growing up, you know, when was the last time you heard it? And yet you almost surely remembered it. That's the power of experience. But of course, when we design real-life experiences, we have way more tools than just the verbal ones. We have so many tools at our disposal. We have all the tools of verbal storytelling, plus all the tools of filmmaking and theater, plus all the tools of business. This is only a tiny fraction of the methods we can use. We can use lighting to create a mood, to show what we want and hide what we don't want. We can use scale to make people feel small or huge or cramped or lonely. We can use music to create emotions, color to prime emotions, composition to direct the eye, smell and taste to trigger memories and get right to that reptilian brain. We can use spectacle to awe people, illusion to make anything happen, accessibility and service to make people feel welcome. Really the sky is the limit. And that's because every little thing contributes, like literally everything. Experience is the sum total of every little action between you and the environment, you and the employee, you and the brand. It all adds up. Things you might not even consider. Efficiency, for example. How many people can experience your attraction per hour, right? That's called theoretical hourly ride capacity. And that determines how long people have to wait. And that's a huge determinant of how happy or pissed guests are. And even within the queue, right? Not all hour-long waits are created equally. Standing in one spot for an hour in the sun is a completely different experience than walking briskly through an air-conditioned forest. Accessibility. I've mentioned this a couple times already because it's so important, but the experience of a theme park can be drastically different if you're a young, able-bodied person, or a young person who uses a wheelchair, or a young person who needs to push an old person in that wheelchair all day. If you're on crutches all day, it's a different experience. If you have chronic pain, like those cobblestones in the street no longer appear charming. That small step up or down into a ride vehicle can suddenly become a huge effort and maybe not worth attempting at all. Experiences can completely change depending on who the audience is. And accessibility goes hand in hand with inclusivity. I think they're really two sides of the same issue, including economic inclusivity. Right, the family that had to drain their savings to visit is having a very different experience than a family who can afford to go whenever and buy all the premium add-ons. The black guest is having a very different experience to a white guest when they see a stage full of black performers. The gay guest is having a different experience than the straight guest when they find out the business donates to anti-LGBT groups. People who need to change a tampon or breastfeed in a hot, sweaty theme park are having a very different experience than those that aren't. The fat guest is having a different experience than the thin. Old from young, liberal from conservative, blind, deaf, etc., etc., etc. And we really have to keep in mind how everything contributes to each audience in different ways. So often we can forget and assume one default guest, but it's simply not the case. But there are some good rules of thumb to follow to help us with this. These are affectionately called Mickey's 10 Commandments. They were developed by the longtime head of Imagineering, Marty Sklar, for Disney, but they really apply to all of experience design. We don't have nearly enough time to dive into each one in depth. That would be and is an entire presentation unto itself, but take a glance over them. Many speak exactly to what we've been talking about, and I want to focus on one in particular. Avoid contradictions. In my opinion, pretty much all of experience design boils down to this idea. If you decide that your brand identity is fun and happiness, then conceptually the task at hand for the experience designer is pretty straightforward. Simple, though not easy. You want to eliminate everything that isn't fun and everything that doesn't cause happiness for your guests, and all of your guests. If you want your guests to feel sad, then you're going to do everything you can to make a sad environment. Where experiences always get into trouble is when they start narratively saying one thing and experientially doing something different. Remember this? Every airline says you're their valued customer, says they want to serve you and their guest. All their marketing is about traveling the world, aspirational voyages to far-off places. And then they stick you in a tin can in a seat that makes the Iron Maiden look like a lazy boy and have the gall to charge you for an ounce bag of stale pretzels that used to be free. They make buying tickets an exasperating experience where the cost varies by how many times you blink, apparently, and the architecture of the airline terminal is lofty and full of air and light. It signifies freedom and movement. And then you're subject to grueling security screenings that treat you like a gang of murderous toddlers, and constantly confined and told there's places you can't go. Experience design is about implied messages. If the experience doesn't match the story you're telling, well, then you're just telling a different story, and worse, you're lying about it. And people are really sensitive to this. And it matters both within attractions, where, say, a ride about being fast and furious might need to be fast and furious, and also for your brand and business as a whole. It comes back to this idea of setup and payoff. Previously we talked about how setup and payoff was used in linear narratives. You create an event so that later the consequences of that event can play out in a way that demonstrates the theme. Well, setup and payoff can be used purely in experience design to similar ends. Guests come in with expectations, and you can use things like your brand identity or the story to set those expectations. And then how you live up to those expectations, exceed them or don't, ultimately shapes their experience. Some people call this fulfilling the wish. If an experience doesn't meet the expectations guests have going into it, it will never be satisfying no matter how well done it is. For instance, why do sketchy restaurants always have the best food? Is it because the food is amazing, or is it because your expectations are moderated? It's about setting expectations. It's about implied messages. It's ultimately about the emotions that you create. And like I said just a bit ago, these implied messages aren't universal to everyone. So you have to be careful. You have to do research, get feedback to make sure you're saying what you want to be saying. It's not a thing you can really avoid. If you don't think about the implied messages you're sending, you're still going to end up sending them. You just won't know about it. So thinking about all that, take a look at these two chairs. What are the implied messages these chairs create? What emotions do they create? They're clearly different, right? One is curvy and more fluid. One is very rigid. One is relatively minimal. The other is very ornate. Where might you find one versus the other? The one on the left feels like it might be seen in maybe, a fancy parlor or waiting room. The one on the right, though, is practically a throne. It would be right at home inside a castle, but utterly out of place in a grandmother's cottage. How does each chair make you feel? Which one looks more comfortable? The one on the left? Are you considering all your guests? Right? A larger guest might look at the one on the left and immediately see it as uncomfortable because those arms are going to squeeze right into their sides. Is that an experience you want to create? Or as another example, let's look at this house. What does it communicate? It's ornate, probably built by someone with money, right? It's Victorian or maybe Queen Anne. So it's either old or it's intended to look old. There's a big lawn in front. It's pretty clearly intending to look stately and impressive. Here's a question though. Does it look welcoming? Theme park architecture is often Victorian because it's associated with nostalgia and simpler times, and in turn Victorian architecture as a whole can seem kind of happy because of that Disneyland association. And when I see this house, that's my first emotion, but then it quickly goes away. Something feels off, a little more foreboding. Why? Is it because of the dead trees? Because it's winter? Maybe. Or maybe it's the cognitive dissonance that this house that's supposed to be welcoming, the sidewalk leading up to it, it just dead ends in grass. There's no actual defined way to approach this house. It's just a big yard. This design is suddenly saying, stay away. And that's especially the case for people who aren't able-bodied, who not only have no defined pathway, but are also faced with a heap of stairs. How much is the stay away message amplified for them? Of course, that's not the only way to create experiences. You can also do it much more directly. You can always just shoot guests out of a cannon or fling them through the air, and that will create a visceral experience too. These are visceral experiences, experiences that come directly from the senses. Most often when we think about creating visceral experiences, we think about rides. There's no shortage of ways to fling a body around in various ways. And depending on how you do it, you can create awe, fear, excitement. And visceral experiences needn't be limited, only to kinesthetic stuff. Taste, smell, sound, those are all visceral too. But you can string these sensations together and start to create a progression of sensations, of emotions, really, and begin to tell a story that way. Rather than speaking to the mind, you speak to the body. It's actually quite similar to another kind of visceral experience, music. Music and songs actually have a lot of similarities with rides and experiences. They're both progressions of physical sensations, and they can speak directly to your emotions. The emotions are really embedded into a song, or the steel track of a coaster. And then the story, if it exists, is layered on top of it to provide context. It creates sort of a feedback loop, exactly like the feedback loop we talked about earlier between experience and narrative. It is the same feedback loop. Which brings me to the concept musical. Now, I'm convinced concept musicals provide deep, deep insight into how many of the most famous attractions work. So, Company is generally cited as the first concept musical, and it inspired a bunch more that came after it. The innovation with Company is that it's a show that basically forgoes a traditional plot. It's somewhat similar to an earlier format, The Review, except it's intentionally crafted sort of to tell an original story with original material instead of pre-existing stuff. Instead of a plot with a beginning, middle, and end, in a chain of cause of effect and all that, it substitutes it in a loose framing narrative. Bobby, our protagonist, is facing his 35th birthday, still unmarried and in a bit of a crisis about it. It's more of a premise than a plot, really. The creators of the show have described it as happening entirely in one moment inside his head. Instead of that chain of cause and effect, we're given a series of vignettes with 6 different couples that are in Bobby's life, and each vignette showcases one aspect of marriage. The show's theme is about marriage, and rather than exploring it through an elaborate metaphor, it explores it through a series of fictional examples, slowly working its way through, figuring out what it thinks about the theme. And the examples are roughly placed in a way to mirror the traditional emotional progression of a plot. Things start off funny and casual, and gradually the tension builds until a climax at the end. Marriage is funny. Marriage is about the little things you do together. Marriage is wonderful, but also a burden. Marriage would be better if you had freedom to not be married all the time. Freedom itself is a burden. Commitment is terrifying and wonderful. Marriage is about wanting somebody, not somebody, and on and on. It's arguments and counter-arguments. Eventually, the show comes to its conclusion. Marriage allows you to have somebody to be alive with. And for added emphasis, the thesis and conclusion are more or less explicitly stated in song. All concept musicals work somewhat similarly to this. There's a framing narrative, a series of vignettes that develop the theme and lead to a climax, and a resolution where the final conclusion is reached. It's actually a structure not unique to the concept musical. If you think about police procedural TV shows, for instance, each episode tends to be self-contained, but over the course of seasons, the show nevertheless has a very specific point of view about the, quote-unquote honorable work of detectives and law enforcement. It's also common in anthology series like The Twilight Zone or Black Mirror, where each episode explores a, closer look on a topic on a broader theme of our exploding technology. One of my favorite examples is the Spoon River anthology from Edgar Lee Masters. It's something I found in my high school English class. But it's a collection of headstone epigraphs across a small town. Right, this type of storytelling uses constellations of events woven together rather than a specific sequence of cause and effect. Which, if you'll remember, is something that nonlinear storytelling relies upon as well. Well, it turns out that when you create a specific path through a nonlinear story, you end up with something that I call the concept attraction. The concept attraction is literally just a concept musical turned into an attraction. It fuses linear and nonlinear storytelling together. You're put on a linear path through the environment, and therefore you can have a defined emotional progression, but you're whisked through a constellation of events that create an overall tapestry exploring a theme. You're given a loose framing narrative, which provides the structure necessary to explore a theme more broadly, and then you yourself become the connective tissue between the vignettes. You become Bobby, and as such, even though the story is told through other people, it's essentially about you. You're the one that journeys through the world. This type of attraction was, from the early 1960s to the late 1980s, practically the formula for any dark ride, and many of the best attractions ever made follow this structure, often quite literally, complete with the theme song. They're musicals in the truest sense of the word. But if you think about the idea more broadly, the music isn't strictly needed, and attractions like Knott's Berry Farm's Calico Mine Train or Efteling's Dreamflight, or even modern immersive theater attractions like Sleep No More all follow a similar kind of pattern. And you might be thinking that pattern seems kind of familiar. State an idea, explore arguments and counter-arguments, come to a conclusion. Where have I seen that before? Well, let's take a blast to the past to your 4th grade English class. You remember this? The 5-paragraph essay? Well, what if I told you that everything we just talked about is basically just this? That every story, that theme, it all boils down to this. Let's dive in. So, just in case you don't remember how a 5-paragraph essay works, or you've blocked that trauma out, here's a recap. In the first paragraph, you state the main topic, what you plan to talk about within that topic, and give a hint of what your conclusion might be. Then in the next 3 paragraphs, you provide supporting evidence, 1 paragraph for each argument. And then you wrap it all up in the final paragraph, where you summarize what you said and you state your conclusion. If you've ever been given advice on how to give a presentation, it's the same structure. Tell them what you're going to tell them what you've told them. What they didn't tell you is that this also applies to storytelling more broadly, including fiction, and that you're allowed as many examples and arguments as you want to work your way through to your point. Case in point, Pirates of the Caribbean. If you haven't ridden it lately, or haven't seen the Disneyland version, you should watch it now. How does Pirates of the Caribbean tell its story? Well, it starts off right off the bat telling you it's about pirates in the Caribbean. It's got a whole little title sequence even in that front lobby. And just in case you miss it, there's a pirate head that'll tell you a few minutes later, "Hey, are you looking for salty old pirates? They're in here!" It's a framing narrative. We're going on a boat ride through the bayou and going to see pirates. Tell them what you're going to tell them. Then the boat goes down a waterfall and the story begins. Tell them. We see a series of vignettes strung together, each demonstrating some aspect of pirates, and each grows in tension as the overall experience is shaped. We go into a cave and see a bunch of dead pirates and their loot. Pirates are mysterious. Pirates are scary. We find the pirates and end up in the middle of a battle. Pirates are adventurous, exciting. We see them torturing the mayor and auctioning off women or chickens and valuables. Right? Pirates are treacherous. Then we see them drunk, singing a silly song in increasingly funny situations. They burn down the town, they get trapped in a jail cell, and have to beg a dog for the keys. Pirates are ridiculous. Finally, we find ourselves in the armory, where the drunk pirates are one bad shot away from blowing themselves up. Pirates reap what they sow. A conclusion. Tell them what you've told them. It's working exactly like a concept musical because it is a concept musical. It's working just like a 5-paragraph essay, just with a few more examples. Or let's look at another classic attraction, the Haunted Mansion. Same thing. We walk right into a mansion called the Haunted Mansion, right there in the name. Then, in the pre-show, we see a bunch of people dying in funny ways as our tour begins, and the corpse of a man who hung himself. The attraction is telling us right from the beginning that this is a story about death, and it's going to use dark humor. Tell them what you're going to tell them. Set expectations. Framing narrative. It even hints at the theme. Death is inescapable. This chamber has no windows and no doors. Find a way out. And the only way out is my way, which is death itself. Then the story begins. Tell them. It explores death. Death is spooky. Statues follow us and shadows flicker around. Hallways stretch on forever. Death is macabre. Corpses try to escape coffins. Death is supernatural. There's a seance and then ghosts suddenly appear. Death is kind of funny, actually. Dozens of silly ghosts singing busts. Opera singers that died because they sung too high a note. And how does the ride end? By restating the thesis it had in the beginning. Hitchhiking ghosts. A ghost will follow you home. Death is inescapable. But it's kind of funny all the same. Might as well enjoy it. It's actually quite a sophisticated little story. And just in case you're still having trouble seeing it, and don't quite believe me that this is indeed story, let me bring back our friends again, the pigs. Now, these little guys have been with us throughout this whole journey. We've seen how they use narrative to communicate ideas. We've seen how they use experience to bring those ideas to life and create emotion. But let's look again at how the story is told. Maybe looking at it like this will be more helpful. How does the plot of the Three Little Pigs go again? The Three Little Pigs are introduced, and we're told they're going out into the world to build their houses. They're cautioned to work hard, and then each pig builds a house. One is very lazy and builds one out of straw. One is slightly less lazy and builds theirs out of stick. And the third one is a hard worker and builds theirs out of brick. 3 examples. How interesting. Then in the conclusion, the one who builds the house out of brick prevails. The one who worked hard wins. It's the moral of the story. It's a conclusion. Introduction, examples, conclusion. Wait a minute. The Three Little Pigs is a near literal 5-paragraph essay. It's been one the whole time. Because this is how stories work. This is how theme entertainment works. This is how concept musicals work. It's how all of it works. The theme is not just about ideas. It's about argument. Stories are arguments. They argue for a specific set of values, a specific opinion about something, a perspective on a question, a moral. The purpose of the story is to propose a topic and then work its way towards some sort of conclusion. And what we do as storytellers, as designers and theme entertainment professionals, is figure out how to make the argument, whether it's about something super silly or something deep, about something fictional or about something based in real life. Story is the process by which we argue and come to our theme. So now we can take all that we've learned, all these pieces, and begin to create something. So we know what theme and subject are. We know what narrative and experience are. We know what story is. How do we put this all together to create a piece of themed entertainment? Before we get into that, there's one more thing I want to talk about. Neuroscience! Now, I'm not a scientist, and this is definitely going to be a simplification of how the brain works, but it should be good enough for our purposes. So a lot of people tend to think of the brain as just a hard drive or a recorder of live events. And when you remember something, that you're just accessing that file and playing it back like a movie. But that's not really what happens. Instead, your brain is actually recreating that event on the spot, trying to get the neurons to fire in the same pattern as before. Now, generally, the way this science is talked about is as an illustration of the brain's fallibility. Every time the memory is recreated, your current feelings and emotions about the situation, flaws in the narrative, and all that, actually end up changing it. You can end up remembering something that didn't even happen, which I think rightfully unsettles a lot of us. But there's another side to that bit of information. How does the brain know what neurons to fire to recreate that memory? By the story it creates about the set of events. And if the story changes based on something someone says in the present or a change in emotion, the memory itself is malleable. What this means is that actually in the moment when something is happening to you, there is no story. It's just a series of events and sensations, and ideally ones that put you in a flow state, where you're paying attention to nothing but the experience and lose track of everything else. We might call that true immersion, but anyway, in the moment, it's just a set of experiences. But when we look back on it, we create a narrative. We look for the story in the set of events. We'll create a story even if it's not there. And that story is what we actually remember. That story is what enables us to remember the rest of the experience. Remember this? Story is what exists in the mind after an experience. The whole goal of creating a themed entertainment experience is this: what exists in the mind of the guest after it's over, what they take with them. Let's look at exactly how this happens. When the guest arrives at your attraction, they're going to go through some series of experiences over some length of time. Now, like we said, in order to remember that, the brain is going to sort through all those experiences and try to find a narrative. It's going to form this narrative through piecing together clues with things like forensic storytelling and the implied messages of the metaphors and experiences and the ideas that it sees. Then, when the guest next thinks about the experience, either immediately afterward or days later, whenever, they're going to use that narrative to recreate the experience in their mind, literally reimagine it. And if we do our job exceptionally well, they might even remember an experience that was better than the one we designed. Right? There's plenty of stories, actually, about how when Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln debuted at the 1964 World's Fair, people recalled that animatronic doing all sorts of things he couldn't do, like shaking hands with the audience. Now, this imagined experience that exists within the guest, that's the thing they'll take with them. That's the end product. That memory is a story, their own personal story that they carry with them and is unique to them, which is why it's pretty special. Now, what's the role of a designer in this process? All of us. How do we engineer those experiences to create that final story? Well, we can literally reverse engineer the brain and do the process backwards. First, we create a story. We create the story we want the guest to end up with. What idea do we want them to leave with? What memory? Then we analyze it. We break it down into subject and theme. We analyze what emotions we need. We do everything we've talked about in this lecture. We take that analysis to build a physical environment imbued with that narrative and use that to create a series of experiences. In short, we craft experiences to get the guest to make narrative. And when we're all done, if we did it right, the story the guest ends up with inside of themselves that their brains have created on their own will more or less match with what we intended from the beginning. Ultimately, that's what we're trying to do. And if we succeed, we can make a real big impact in a guest's life. You know, what makes team entertainment unique is this ability to relate story through experience, experiential learning. There's a difference between knowing and understanding. I can tell you that the Grand Canyon is big, right? I can show you pictures even, but no one can really truly grasp it until they've experienced it for themselves. But once they have, they understand it in this deep, deep, permanent way. Because of this process we're talking about here, so much of how we come to understand the world works this way. There's so much you can't truly understand until you've experienced it firsthand. And as theme entertainment designers, we can give people that opportunity in ways no other storyteller can. You know, teach them something they didn't know, connect them with their history, give them some experience that they couldn't have had otherwise, make them feel seen and heard, excite them about a topic, inspire them to take action. There's countless stories about children who've healed through the environments we create. People who are inspired to pursue a career by something they saw on a ride or an exhibit. Urban design policies that have changed because they saw how well run a park was. People who have never before truly understood a historical event, finally having it connect with them and bringing them to tears. Adults and children alike moved by the opportunity to meet an idolized character or visit a more perfect world for just a little bit. You know, theme entertainment takes a lot of resources to create. A lot of money, a lot of land, a lot of people. And when we create these experiences, we really need to be thinking about why it is exactly we're devoting all these resources to something that can be kind of frivolous, right? This isn't climate science or medical research or directly helping the disadvantaged in our society. You know, strictly speaking, what we create is not really a necessity. Sure, fun, leisure, theater, and art are necessities for humanity, absolutely. But there's an awful lot of cheaper ways to do it. Themed entertainment really needs to do something more. And luckily for us, it's extremely well positioned to do that. Lots of people see the experiences we create. Millions and millions of people. Themed entertainment is a huge cultural force, and that is where this medium has such importance. We have the ability to reach a broad audience and inspire them to go out and make the actual change. We have the ability to model for a really large audience what the world can be like. The absolute best potential themed entertainment has is that story that guests take with them back home into the real world, those ideas and what they might do with them. So let's review what we've talked about. Let me tell you what I've told you. Remember? Remember that experience times narrative equals theme. Again, if there's nothing else you take away from this entire lecture, remember that. The two working together is what makes all of this work. And remember that themes are ideas, morals, questions, values. Remember that subject and theme work together. How does the subject demonstrate the theme? What are we saying about the subject? What metaphor do they create? What do they tell us about the world? We also talked about how experiences are the implied messages that we walk away with. What does the environment say about us? Experiences are emotions. How does the experience make us feel? We talked about the importance of avoiding contradictions, about how all of what we're doing in some way boils down to avoiding anything that contradicts the message we're trying to send. And we demonstrated that stories are the arguments by which we arrive at the theme. And that in any attraction or experience, we're going to be laying out an argument scene by scene, whether it's directly or whether it's through metaphor. And finally, remember that when it comes to themed entertainment, story ultimately is in the guest's hands. It's what they leave with, it's what exists in the mind after they experience it. We don't want to tell guests the story. We want the environment to inevitably lead to them in discovering it. And one more thing before we wrap up. I want to touch on briefly how to use these ideas that we've talked about. I think it's really important that we all understand what's going on when we're making themed entertainment, but also to leave room for inspiration, right? In the words of one of my favorite food YouTubers, Glenn and Friends, this isn't a formula or a recipe, it's a method. You want to learn it and internalize it and then forget it so that hopefully you can do it intuitively. And we've talked about the similarities between experience and music, right? Leave some room for jazz. But not too much. We still want to be intentional. If we don't intentionally think about the ideas we want to be communicating, well, they're still going to work their way in there and we just won't know about it. And that's the last thing that we want, right? Remember the chairs and the sidewalk to nowhere? Everything is communicating some message, and what makes us themed entertainment designers is we think about that message a lot. So where do you go from here? Well, this wouldn't be a class if it didn't have some homework! So y'all be delighted to know there's a worksheet coming your way. Now, don't take this assignment too seriously. You'll see in the provided examples I certainly didn't. But it is a good exercise to hopefully get the brain working and try to start experiencing these ideas in practice. It's a very simplified way to start generating themed experiences. So just follow the steps. You'll want to start with a subject and a theme. These really can be anything you want. I promise that any theme can be demonstrated with any subject, though some are going to be more challenging than others. And this also reflects how things work in real life, right? Sometimes you know what you want to say, but you don't know how you want to demonstrate it. And sometimes you know the place you want to take guests, but you don't know what you want them to think about it. So either pick them at random or really give it some thought, your choice. And then you're going to want to figure out how to connect the two. This is kind of the key step. You can do it really simply, just the subject is an idea, or you make it more complicated. The subject is an allegory, whatever. The sky's the limit. And then you'll want to explain why. List those examples, list those reasons, right? Remember the 5-paragraph essay. And also list the emotions that you think might be associated with that theme. Try and match them up with the examples, where they make sense. And with that information, remember, like I said, 5-paragraph essay, framing narrative, argument, make your case. Don't be afraid to mix up the order or reuse some bits, whatever you like. This worksheet works for rides and exhibits, but it could also work for a themed land or a public place. Each scene in a ride is really kind of equivalent to each location in a land. Just remember that in a land, you don't necessarily have as much control over what order people see things in. And I've tried to provide examples for both, as well as themed entertainment based in fiction and reality, a more simple theme compared to a more complex one. Play around, have fun. I'd love to see what you create. And that's it. Thank you all so much for sticking with me for the last hour or so. I hope that you found it useful. So thank you all again, and I hope to see you again soon. Go make great things.